Your job is disappearing and you don't even know it yet. Sarah worked 12 years, trusted. Then one Tuesday, we're restructuring. Translation, an AI now does her job for pennies. But here's what nobody tells you. The people who understand the AI shift aren't just surviving, they're thriving, earning 40% more, becoming unfireable, not by competing with AI, but by partnering with it. Inside Unfireable, you'll get the 5 human advantages AI can't replicate, no coding needed, the 90-day relevance audit to spot threats 18 months early, and real pivoting strategies that boosted salaries 40% in months. The paperback is $13,999, hardcover $21.99. But right now, get it for just $5.99, less than your morning coffee. For that, you get MIT and Stanford-backed strategies to future-proof your career. 5 years from now, there will be 2 types: those who became unfireable and those who became unemployable. Your relevance is depreciating every day you wait. Don't hope your job survives. Start ensuring you thrive. Click the link in bio to grab Unfireable on Amazon today. Your career can't afford to wait.
What happens when the most powerful weapon in modern warfare isn't a missile or a tank, but a suitcase-sized satellite terminal that can restore internet to an entire nation within hours of arriving on a commercial flight? In February 2022, as Russian forces advanced on Kyiv and terrestrial communications infrastructure crumbled under bombardment, thousands of Starlink terminals arrived in Ukraine. Not through military supply chains, but via civilian couriers and commercial airlines, becoming the invisible backbone that kept government operations, military coordination, and civilian morale alive when traditional networks failed. This wasn't science fiction. It was the moment's space-based internet, transformed from convenience technology into geopolitical game-changer, demonstrating that orbital infrastructure now holds decisive power in 21st century conflicts. By 2026, this transformation accelerates beyond battlefield applications into fundamental reshaping of how nations exercise sovereignty, control information flows, and project influence across borders without firing a single shot. Traditional concepts of digital sovereignty, where governments asserted control over internet infrastructure within their physical borders, are crumbling beneath constellations of low Earth orbit satellites that recognize no national boundaries, cannot be switched off at border crossings, and render terrestrial censorship infrastructure increasingly obsolete. Countries that spent decades building sophisticated Great Firewalls and internet gatekeeping systems now confront an existential challenge. How do you regulate data streams arriving from 550 kilometers above your territory at 27,000 kilometers per hour? The physics of orbital mechanics create an asymmetry that favors connectivity over control. Satellite signals blanket entire regions indiscriminately, making selective censorship technically difficult and economically unsustainable compared to terrestrial filtering systems. This asymmetry empowers citizens in authoritarian states with unprecedented access to uncensored information, while simultaneously challenging democratic governments' ability to enforce legitimate regulations around privacy, taxation, and lawful intercept requirements. The regulatory vacuum governing space-based internet creates dangerous precedents where private corporations effectively become de facto telecommunications regulators is sent for millions of users across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, making unilateral decisions about service availability, pricing, and acceptable use policies that would traditionally fall under national sovereignty. When SpaceX temporarily restricted Starlink's capabilities near the Russia-Ukraine border in 2023, following concerns about drone warfare escalation, the company demonstrated power traditionally reserved for nation-states: the ability to weaponize or de-weaponize communication infrastructure through corporate policy decisions rather than international treaties or legislative action.
The geopolitical realignment triggered by space-based internet extends far beyond censorship battles into fundamental restructuring of international relations, military doctrine, and economic development pathways that will define global power structures through 2026 and beyond. Traditional great power competition, centered on controlling physical territory, sea lanes, and terrestrial infrastructure, now expands vertically into orbital domains, where communication dominance determines battlefield outcomes, economic resilience, and diplomatic leverage. Nations possessing indigenous satellite internet capabilities, currently limited to the United States through Starlink, with China's Guowang and Europe's IRIS² programs, racing to achieve operational status by 2027, gain asymmetric advantages in crisis response, disaster recovery, and military operations that terrestrial-dependent adversaries cannot match. During natural disasters that destroy ground infrastructure, orbital networks maintain continuity of government operations and humanitarian coordination when traditional systems fail. A capability that proved decisive during Hurricane Maria's devastation of Puerto Rico and will become standard expectation by 2026. This resilience transformed space-based internet from luxury service into critical national infrastructure, forcing governments to integrate orbital connectivity into emergency preparedness frameworks and military contingency planning. The military implications accelerate most dramatically. Drone warfare evolves beyond line-of-sight limitations as satellite connectivity enables operators to control unmanned systems from continents away with minimal latency, while autonomous weapons systems leverage orbital networks for real-time target recognition and coordination across distributed battlefields. By 2026, every major military power develops counterspace capabilities, specifically targeting low Earth orbit constellations, not through expensive anti-satellite missiles that create dangerous debris fields, but through electronic warfare systems, capable of jamming or spoofing satellite signals, cyber operations compromising ground station security, and diplomatic pressure leveraging economic interdependence. The vulnerability of concentrated orbital infrastructure creates new deterrence dynamics where attacking another nation's satellite network risks triggering cascading failures across civilian services, financial transactions, emergency response, transportation systems that modern societies cannot function without. This mutual vulnerability may paradoxically stabilize great power competition by raising the cost of orbital conflict beyond acceptable thresholds, similar to nuclear deterrence theory, but applied to communication infrastructure rather than weapon systems. Economic development pathways undergo equally profound transformation as orbital connectivity bypasses traditional infrastructure investment requirements that constrained growth in developing regions. Nations no longer need to build expensive fiber optic backbones or negotiate complex spectrum allocations to participate in digital economies. Citizens connect directly to global cloud services, e-commerce platforms, and financial networks through terminals, requiring minimal technical expertise to operate. This democratization of connectivity accelerates digital entrepreneurship across Africa and Southeast Asia, where mobile money systems like M-Pesa now integrate with global payment networks without passing through national banking infrastructure that often imposes restrictive capital controls. The resulting capital mobility challenges governments' ability to manage currency stability and tax digital transactions, creating regulatory dilemmas that no international framework currently addresses. Simultaneously, orbital networks enable remote work at scale across developing regions, allowing skilled professionals to participate in global labor markets without emigrating, potentially reversing brain drain patterns that deprive nations of talent while creating new dependencies on Western platform economies. The concentration risk remains substantial. Over 80% of operational low Earth orbit communication satellites belong to a single corporate entity, creating unprecedented single-point failure vulnerability for global connectivity that exceeds even the most centralized terrestrial internet exchange points. Geopolitical tensions between the United States and China intensify around orbital infrastructure, as both nations recognize that whoever controls the communication layer between Earth and space effectively controls information flows for half the China planet. China's aggressive development of its Guowang constellation, targeting full operational capability by 2027 with 13,000 satellites, represents not merely commercial competition, but strategic necessity to avoid dependence on American-controlled orbital infrastructure during potential conflict scenarios. The resulting bipolar orbital architecture emerging by 2026 creates digital spheres of influence mirroring Cold War alignments, where nations choose between American or Chinese orbital networks based on geopolitical alignment rather than technical superiority. A fragmentation of the global internet that orbital connectivity was supposed to prevent. European efforts to develop independent Iris-squared constellation reflect similar sovereignty concerns, though funding constraints and bureaucratic delays threaten to leave the continent dependent on American infrastructure, despite political desires for autonomy. The regulatory vacuum governing these developments proves increasingly dangerous, as no international body possesses authority to establish rules for orbital internet operations, spectrum allocation between competing constellations, or liability frameworks for service disruptions affecting critical infrastructure. The United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space lacks enforcement mechanisms, while national regulators operate within territorial boundaries that orbital networks inherently transcend. By 2026, this governance gap forces emergency diplomatic negotiations after major incidents, perhaps a satellite collision creating debris fields threatening all constellations, or corporate decisions to restrict service during humanitarian crises triggering international condemnation. The outcome may finally establish the first binding international framework for orbital internet governance, but likely only after crisis forces action rather than through proactive cooperation. Meanwhile, the fundamental power shift remains irreversible. Control over information flows, the lifeblood of modern economies and military operations. Transitions from terrestrial infrastructure, subject to national sovereignty, toward orbital infrastructure, subject to corporate control and orbital mechanics. Nations that adapt by developing indigenous capabilities, negotiating favorable terms with constellation operators, and integrating orbital resilience into critical infrastructure planning gain strategic advantages. Those that cling to terrestrial-centric models of internet sovereignty face increasing vulnerability to information warfare, economic disruption, and loss of citizen trust, as their control mechanisms prove increasingly porous against orbital alternatives. The 2026 landscape therefore presents not a finished transformation, but an accelerating transition where the rules remain contested, the power dynamics unstable, and the ultimate architecture of orbital sovereignty still unwritten, making this decade the decisive period when humanity determines whether space-based internet becomes tool for liberation or instrument of new forms of control, operating beyond traditional accountability mechanisms. If you found this exploration of orbital internet's geopolitical transformation insightful and valuable, please subscribe to Tomorrow Intelligence for our ongoing coverage of breakthrough innovations reshaping our world. Like this video to help others discover how space technology is fundamentally altering global power structures beyond headlines and hype. Share with fellow geopolitics enthusiasts, technology professionals, and anyone who understands that the next battlefield isn't on land or sea, but in the orbital space above our heads. Hit the bell icon to receive notifications whenever we publish new content examining how artificial intelligence, space infrastructure, and digital sovereignty converge to define tomorrow's geopolitical landscape. Tomorrow Intelligence delivers deeply researched analysis, separating genuine paradigm shifts from overhyped claims, because understanding our technological future requires clarity, not clickbait. Join our community of forward-thinking innovators navigating the complex intersection of technology, power, and human progress. Sway, Vo, Script.